Hi everyone, welcome. Some of you might already recognize the system we're checking in on. Some of the visual clues of the fact that this is the castings boulders bin, a little bit unusual from the perspective of a number of things, I guess. It's really two systems, one in the other. The shallower tub rests inside the deeper tub, the idea being that the lower tub would catch any excess moisture that might come dripping through this top tub, which has perforations, holes on the bottom. And we did that for a while in the beginning to really help the system stay super damp, but at this late stage of the game, we're probably striving more towards seeing the system eventually dry off a little bit, you know. But for now, since we're foraging since the last check-in being 2 weeks ago, we decided we're going to start into the foraging, which meant that that was their last portion of bedding. And you know, with foraging, the whole idea with no bedding being added going forward, the idea is that they work off the remaining stuff that's already in there versus getting new stuff. But you know, if you think about it, the system really did sort of already start out as castings, boulders. So the little bit of bedding that got added along the way over the course of the many 18 feedings would have included in various different portions and amounts, a little bit of bedding here and there. But that last feeding we added included bedding, very deliberate application of bedding, and it'll be the last at this point. So let's see how the feeding's coming along. And you know, the last feeding was going to be the last time we put the feeding on this side of the bin, because you know, out of these 18 feedings, right here, 13 of those have been in this ping-pong orientation, switching back and forth. It's 6 months now. I was surprised that it had been going on that long and for that many feeding intervals. I guess you sort of just get used to it. The worms in this system always seem so nice and plump. Chubby worms, clearly not lacking in moisture or food. And you know, I smell citrus, I see banana peels and stems, I see a variety of leftovers. And what we did every time in here, every time we would check the state of the previous feeding and then prepare to move over to the opposite side of the bin to feed over there, we would collect up any residual bedding bits or food scraps, leftovers that we would find during the check-in, as I'm doing here now. The last check-in, we were coming in after a feeding that included potato peels. And the potato peels might get stripped clean of all the yummy potato on them, but the peels will stick around. So we're going to see a good many of those still in here. And I actually thought about including more potato peels in today's feeding, but I opted for stuff that is really in the spirit of driving the system towards being harvestable, which means stuff that doesn't include any slow composting stuff. So here I've got figs, carrots, and coffee, all stuff I assume is going to be popular and get consumed soon. And some of you might be wondering, well, what do we do now that we're not going to be ping-pong feeding? That just means that we're not going to be positioning the next feeding over on the opposite side, as we normally would have if ping-pong feeding was going to continue. I guess to help promote a good, effective foraging phase, I kind of want the worms all over the place. I don't want them huddling in one particular end of the bin after a focused feeding. So my idea to try to keep a good bit of worm traffic everywhere is to spread the food out everywhere. So rather than positioning their food ping-pong style this time, and not even following the approach that I usually use, which is to create a little crevasse down the center, today I thought I would just scatter it, you know. Scatter it around. And speaking of scattering, as you can see, I've been sort of scattering this feeding zone's contents, trying to see if I could spot any additional fairly large objects. You because I guess I'm doing it out of a force of habit. Perhaps it's just because my curious brain wants to see what I'm dealing with as far as a complete tally of all the larger bits of leftovers that are still in here, so that as I add new stuff, I can, in my mind, have a picture of how they're doing as far as a food supply goes. And, you know, here and there I've been commenting on just the healthy appearance of these worms in this system. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, so I won't mention it again now. Alright, so that was very fun going through the feeding zone, but now we're going to venture out into the castings boulders here. And here, over the past few check-ins, we've decided that the best approach to eventually end up with no more, or fewer at least, castings boulders was to crush them as you encounter them, because the original premise never really panned out in practice. The whole idea here was, hey, let's give the boulders to the worms and let them break it all down into nice, beautiful, flowing vermicompost. Well, if not for what I'm doing now, which is just grabbing a handful of material and, if possible, crushing any boulders I sense that are larger than the surrounding material, I think we'd still be dealing with a system heavily made up of mainly boulders. Obviously with 240 days worth of castings mixed in. But you got to remember, we started this system with what was thought to be a pretty small population. Now, we're actually making our way over across to where we fed previously, and I couldn't really get all the potato peels out. You can see there was a whole lot of them still in here, and there were probably other leftovers too, so I had a hunch that this feeding zone from the last time would still be pretty heavily populated as the worms continue to work down what's there. So yeah, I forget what the estimate was. For some reason, something under 150 always comes to mind when I think of what the estimated worm count was thought to be in this system after we launched it. Because we did the same here as we do everywhere, which is to get the input of the viewers to see what they think in terms of how many worms were launched into my systems. It's kind of a fun way to come up with an unusual estimated worm count for my systems, which I think might be a little bit more accurate than just me guessing at it with everyone's input. So there's a big pile of leftover foods, but now, rather than using it to build up a specified feeding zone, I'm thinking the best approach here is going to be to sort of spread it all out, and then spreading out all the rest of the food that I bought for them too is how I intended to deploy this, you know. So the carrots are pretty small chopped, and those should spread out pretty easily, provided I'm able to break apart this jumble of frozen stuff. Alright. You know, now I'm starting to wonder if I should have left myself a little pile of material with which I could cover up at the end. But it seems like blending in the carrot bits is not too difficult. Not that everything needs to be submerged. I don't think this is the sort of delicious food item that perhaps a flying insect, a passerby flying insect, might take interest in and cause some sort of infestation here, but still, I think it's always best practice to cover up the feedings when you can. These figs, also pretty good sized chunks of food getting spread out a little bit across the surface here, and those I can kind of imagine some sort of curious insects coming by. Perhaps they catch a whiff of it here. So luckily we don't have to worry too much about it, even though I've got no bedding with which we would be able to cover up. I've got my plastic sheet, so the whole system will be covered up with the plastic sheet. But there's also this last ditch effort to apply the coffee out here in a way that maybe it covers some stuff up. And even the coffee filter, even though we're foraging and no new bedding is supposed to be going in, I could slip in materials that are bedding like like a feeding zone indicator, get it in under the radar, and this way, at least if they do really desperately need something along those lines, then they've got it. And, you know, a lot of times when I get to a certain stage, I don't feel like I could backpedal and account for missed steps, but here it seemed sensible to just remove the feeding zone indicator briefly and give them a little bit of grit to complement their meal. What do you think? Nice first feeding minus any bedding, as foraging is 14 days in now. And what do you think? How does the material look as far as it's coming along, you know? I always imagine that this system would be very quick in the foraging phase to produce material that's free of stuff like leaf stems, but there's obviously a leaf stem with a very, very puny baby worm on it. So leaf stems are often my measure for whether or not foraging needs to continue or not. So I got a couple things I got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away here. I'm not going to keep you around for that because that's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.